You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles. I'm Frank because I have to be. On today's show, we have a gentleman by the name of Peter Anthony Holder. He is a professional broadcaster, and he's come onto our show, Pleasures and Lifestyles, to tell us about the pleasures and the lifestyles of being a professional broadcaster. Welcome to Frank Talks, Peter Anthony Holder.
Thank you very much, Frank. Pleasure to be here.
All right, let's start with our first question. Peter, where were you born? And tell me things that happened to you in your life that eventually led you into a career of being a broadcaster.
I was born right here in Montreal many years ago. And being a broadcaster is something I've always wanted to be since I was 9 years old. And I spent a lot of time sitting around talking into a tape recorder as a child. A lot of kids were outside playing ball hockey. I was on the balcony doing play-by-play of the kids playing ball hockey.
You were 9 years old when you were doing all of this?
Yes.
What was it that attracted you to that medium and that profession? I mean, as most kids would probably rather be out playing a game rather than calling the play-by-play.
Actually, most kids of my generation, most kids today don't leave their Nintendos.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I listened to a lot of radio when I was growing up, and people like Buddy G, who is now George Morris, who has a production studio in town, whom I used to work for at one point in my past. I grew up listening to Buddy G and Dave Boxer and some other broadcasters who I thought were just legendary, and I thought that sounded like a fun way to make a living. That's what I want to do.
And you really knew yourself at that young an age?
If not sooner, yes.
What do you think made you different in that way than most children of your generation?
I don't know if I was different than most children of my generation, with the exception of maybe I had a strong belief of what it was I wanted to do, and no one was going to deter that. I remember growing up, there was a good friend of mine. We used to hang out together when we were little kids, and people would say, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And all the kids used to say the typical things. I want to be a fireman or a policeman or an astronaut. And he used to say fireman, and I used to say I want to be a radio announcer. And people would think, oh, that's so cute. Those are the things kids say they want to be, and they grow out of it. Well, my friend's a fireman. and I'm a broadcaster. So it's not saying, I mean, when you ask a kid if he wants to be an astronaut, why can't they be an astronaut? Or whatever it is they want to be.
Now, going from, elementary school and into high school, were you very active in any sort of media club?
None whatsoever. None whatsoever.
So when did you start actually participating more towards becoming a broadcaster?
When I was in CEGEP, I guess. I ran the radio station. I also was on the board of a television station at the CEGEP that I was at Dawson College. And basically I ate, drank, and breathed media while I was at school.
Yeah, this sounds familiar. You said Dawson College?
That is correct.
Did you study under Paula Bell?
Absolutely. I think Paula Bell is a genius.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are many people in this country and indeed in this world who can thank their lucky stars and to a certain degree their careers to Paula Bell.
I studied under Paula Bell as well at CFCD TV studios. I also participated on the Dawson radio station, so this is...
Now, what year are we going back to?
Oh, I was there in the early 90s.
Okay, so that's 20 years after me.
And still a connection. I
was there at the beginning of CFCD. And some of the people who were there in that group that were with us at the time have gone on to do quite a few things. Not all of them in front of the camera or in front of the mic, but impressive nonetheless. Patrick Pigeon is a cameraman who has traveled all over the world with Fashion TV, and he still travels all over the world with Fashion TV, and he was part of that group, and he was a cameraman when we were at CFCD. There was a young lady by the name of Joan Tackerson who went on to produce a lot of television shows here in town and have her own production company. And we both did television at CFCD. The list goes on and on and on. A fellow, I'll give you a stage name, Peter Kelligan, who is an actor. You might recognize him from television shows like The Newsroom, which was on the CBC. He played the television news anchor. And he was on the Red Green Show. He was out of that same group of people. And Shatilla, who was out of that same group of people. Pete Marier was out of that same group of people.
What was it like studying at Dawson and Paul Lavelle Studio? Did you all know that you were part of something that was going to grow and continue on for something like 20 years?
Not a clue, because it was right at the beginning. To be honest, it felt like being, remember the big television show MASH?
Mm-hmm.
It felt like being part of a MASH unit. Because if you remember watching that television show, they were on the side of right, but sometimes they broke a few rules to get things done.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that's what it was like being around Paul Lavelle. I think the statute of limitations have expired, so I could say a few things. But Paul cut a few corners, but always in the interest of our education and making us better people and better broadcasters than could have possibly happened otherwise. He fought very, very, very hard for all of us and everything in that department, and that's why I say so many of us have so much to thank him for his tenacity in getting us where we are today.
You know, my very first book, Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, is dedicated to Paul Lavelle for exactly the reasons you state. He totally created an environment that gave people an opportunity to excel, and without him in that structure, I think a lot of people would have not even considered a career in media just because they wouldn't have been as prepared as they were having studied under Paul.
I'll give you a perfect example. Of course, you went to Dawson, so you remember how it worked. You had your discipline courses, you had your English courses, you had your humanities courses, correct?
Correct.
He went to the humanities teachers and said, look, my students spend a lot of time doing what they do. And this is what they want to do. You know, throw me a bone here. Let's help each other, and you can get something, and I can get something, and the students can gain. And that thing was, for instance, I have one of the courses I took was Greek mythology, but I actually didn't go to the Greek mythology class. What I did was I spent time studying Greek mythology to put together a documentary that the teacher could use as a teaching tool. In order to do the show on Greek mythology, I had to study Greek mythology, but I didn't do it by going to class. It was a win-win situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I was doing television. The topic was Greek mythology. You know, I interviewed people and chatted with people. I did, in essence, what I became, and that is an interviewer and a broadcaster, covering a wide range of topics. That's one of the things I got from Paul.
Now, right after you finished CEGEP, did you go on to university, or did you go straight into the workforce?
Actually, I was supposed to go on to university. I had so many people who went through Paul's system, went through SUNY, State University in New York. And I was ready to go there, like so many of my compatriots. But I got a job. I got a job at FM 96. So I never went to university.
That actually happens with a number of people who studied under Paul Lavelle Studio. I mean, half of them would go right into the workforce, and the other half would go into university. And after a few years of university, the half that went to university would meet up with the half that went straight into the workforce.
Yep, absolutely. Paul also taught us to think for ourselves. And, you know, so many things in school are done by rote. Remember this, do that. A leads to B leads to C. Paul taught us that there's another way to get to D. Mm-hmm. You know, he taught us to think for ourselves and to think on our feet. So I think that's why so many people were successful right out of the gate.
So tell me about that first job. How did you land it? What was the interview process? And you know, what was it like to actually finish school and start working in your chosen discipline?
Well, as I said, I hadn't finished school. I actually got the job at FM 96 before I finished CEGEP. I had about I had about a semester to go. I did finish it.
Okay.
Because I mean, there was no way I was going to quit. And my boss was very understanding in that concept. But I had the job before I left Dawson.
And how did you land it? Like, did you just call up the place? Did you send in a portfolio? What was the key that got you that job?
Like so many other places people get a job at, a lot of it had to do with, quite frankly, a certain amount of luck. I mean, in my case, what happened was, again, through the auspices of CFCD, I went to, let me back up a little bit. When I was working at CFCD, so many of us, I don't know what it was like when you were there in the 90s, but several of us were producers. We had our own shows, and my show was an interview show, and the people I was interested in interviewing were people that were of interest to me. And since I was fascinated with broadcasting, I spoke to a lot of people who were broadcasters. So one day I went to FM 96 to do an interview with somebody. Don Jackson was an announcer at FM 96 at the time. I went to do an interview with him, and I had sent out CVs and whatnot to a lot of radio stations in town, just as an aside. But when I was there to record the interview with Don Jackson, it was exactly at the same time that somebody was being fired.
Wow.
And I was hired as an operator. I mean, I was a technical operator for several years.
So you didn't start on air right away?
Oh gosh, no one should.
Really? You don't think that someone should just, if they have the skill, if they have the training, you think that...
No, because they don't. Again, education, what you learn in school, is not the real broadcasting world. And I would say the real broadcasting world under Paul LaBelle was a lot closer to real broadcasting than any school is.
So you took a job working as a technical operator.
Yep.
Okay, I got to ask you this as someone who, has dealt with interns and such. Did you ever get frustrated working on the technical side of things when your interest was to be on the mic?
Never.
Not at all?
Not at all. Not once. Nope, never.
I hear a lot of different stories from people who take a position as a technical operator who hope to be talking on the mic one day. And the bitterness that develops over time because those opportunities just don't present themselves. What would you say to people like that?
Well, first of all, I asked the question, why do people want to get into radio in the first place? And it's the same thing, you hear it, I'll use sports as an analogy. You hear people who say, I want to be a hockey star, or I want to be a baseball player, or I want to be the next great point guard in basketball. And you ask them why they want to do this. Is it because they have a love of the game, or they have a perception of what that particular job, be it in the sports world or the broadcasting world, has to offer? In other words, the fame, the fortune, the trappings that supposedly go along with broadcasting. And 9 times out of 10, it's the trappings. If you don't love working the ground up from broadcasting, then you won't love it when you get to the final destination either, I don't think.
Really?
Really. And by the way, you talk about bitter people who are on the board, or who haven't reached their goal as being on the air.
Mm-hmm.
I could introduce you to just as many people who are on the air who are bitter. So I don't think it has anything to do with what your station is at the station.
So it basically comes down to you're doing it because you have a love of radio, and whether you're working the board or whether you're on the mic, the same passion carries through. And it sounds like you were just happy to be there and be involved in any way.
There are some people out there who grow too tall to be jockeys, and as a result spend a life working around horses,
mm-hmm.
and are just as happy. But they're not the jockey.
I think you've made a very, very important point, and that is, why are you getting into it to begin with?
Exactly. And by the way, when people ask me what it takes to get into radio, and when I talk to people who want to get into the business, the first thing I try to do is talk them out of it. And if I can talk them out of it, then it wasn't the right thing for them in the first place.
That is so powerful. So you don't even start by going into what the business side of it is like. You just spend time trying to talk them out of it. As a test. Yeah. You do this as a test.
I do it as a test.
What signs do you look for that makes you say, okay, this person wants to get into radio for the right reasons?
It goes back to what I said earlier when the kids were outside playing hockey, and I was more interested in broadcasting or talking about them playing hockey than playing the game. As much as it's not like I never played ball hockey, but I got such a kick, such a rush out of doing that I wasn't, when I play ball hockey, I usually played nets. So I wasn't Gump Worsley or Ken Dryden. I didn't pretend to be one of those players but when I was on the balcony, I was Danny Gallivan. I got a rush doing that.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles. We'll be back right after this.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by the Emotional Needs of Men Intro 101 CD. This CD is an introduction to the emotional needs of men as taught by Canada's most international relationship expert, Frank Kermit. Men will judge a woman to either be his ally or his enemy by the way she addresses or violates his emotional needs. What are a man's emotional needs? What role does respect play in men's emotional needs? What does it take to make a man feel the bonding trust necessary for him to commit to a woman? What makes a man commit to one woman and leave another? How can a man have sex with a woman and never love her the way she wants him to? What is missing for him to take that next step in their relationship, and how can a woman learn to earn it? What are the emotional needs of men and the philosophies that make up Frank B. Kermit's ally-enemy theory? How are men's emotional needs different from women's? Why is it that a man who can address all of her emotional needs might still end up in a failing relationship because she cannot address his needs? How can you be sure that the end of a relationship is not all your fault? If you were curious about this Frank philosophy and wanted an introduction, then consider this CD a primer, Men's Emotional Needs 101. The answer to these questions and more in the Emotional Needs of Men Intro CD. Buy this CD now at franktalks.com.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. What would your life be like if you knew exactly what to say and do with women? Learn how to handle women's tests by addressing her emotional needs. By this, you create the type of attraction that will make her see you as the one. This book is a guide for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by 101 Great First Dates, How to Act. This program is about first dates. In the rules for how to act, Frank B. Kermit goes over various guidelines to keep in mind to turn your first dates into the first of many dates with the focus of your affection. How should a person act on a first date? Is sex on a first date a good idea? And if so, how does a person create the opportunity for it? What are some of the things to never do on a first date, and why? The answers to these questions and more in 101 Great First Dates. The First Dates program that will help you build the best first dates possible. On sale now at franktalk.com.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles. I'm Frank because I have to be. We're talking with professional broadcaster Peter Anthony Holder. Welcome back, Peter.
Thank you.
Okay, we've already talked about your past, how you got into the world of broadcast. Let's talk about some of the sacrifices you've had to make, the obstacles you've had to overcome, so that somebody out there who's listening, that wants to do what you do, who wants to become the next Peter Anthony Holder, will be better prepared. So let's start with the sacrifices. What sacrifices do you have to make to work as a broadcaster?
I don't know if there's really any sacrifices. It all depends on what it is you want to do and how passionate you are about it. I mean, it's something that, broadcasting is something I've always wanted to do, and I was 100% focused on it. I don't see myself as making any sacrifices. You know, there are people who say, okay, well, you're single, you don't have a family. Yeah, and your point is, if that was as major a priority as being a broadcaster was for me, then that would have been a direction I would have gone in. This is what I wanted to do. This is what I am. I don't see it as being a sacrifice.
Do you blame being a broadcaster for not having a family or children?
Nope, not at all.
Was it a
Not at all.
wait, just to be clear here, was this a conscious choice to say, I'm going to stay away from getting married and having kids so I can be a broadcaster? Or was this more of a, I'm going to be a broadcaster and the rest of the stuff is something you just didn't pay attention to or forgot to do?
Probably the latter.
Okay. You didn't have that much of a priority in becoming a family man per se?
Not really, no.
Okay. But you're not saying that, if you're going to be a broadcaster, give up the idea of having a family?
No, there are some people out there who are very successful at both. Not necessarily in my generation, though, now I think about it. I mean, most of the people I know who are happily married are usually on their second marriage. But, there are a lot of people. It's interesting. When I got into radio, it's a lot different than it was, or it is now. But when I got into radio, it seems to be that every second broadcaster, either was, on their way to divorce and or alcoholism or both. It's, I mean, there are a lot of stories out there, and I'm not going to name any names, but I think you've heard a lot of the broadcasters of the day in Montreal who would imbibe a drink or two even on the air, and hear a lot of raucous stories about things that took place in radio stations. Those days are gone. But the personalities that make up broadcasters are usually the type of characters that are out there. You've seen, I'm sure, a lot of movies and televisions that depict people who work in radio or people who work in any profession for that matter, and most of the times you hear people saying in those professions, oh gosh, LA law is nothing like the law profession, or Hill Street Blues is nothing like the police departments. WKRP is not a comedy. That is real.
Mm-hmm.
There's been never anything more real than WKRP in Cincinnati. And for years on Frasier was a broadcaster. Well, no. Not really. There's nothing real about Frasier as a psychologist on the radio. The world of the radio that Frasier worked in is pure fiction. WKRP was real.
Okay, let's delve into this because you have used two really great popular culture examples here. What was it about WKRP in Cincinnati that was more real than a program like Frasier?
The characters were a little off the wall, but when you think about them, they became a family per se, but they were all, in a strange way, loners when you think about it. Mm-hmm. I mean, Johnny Fever was in his own little world,
mm-hmm.
and Venus Flytrap was building this persona on the air of a character that maybe he wasn't quite really. Les Nessman,
mm-hmm.
if you never saw Les Nessman but heard Les Nessman, would never put the two together.
Mm-hmm.
And the program director was basically doing his best to herd cats. That's basically what he was doing.
Okay. And let's look at Frasier with Roz or Bulldog.
Frasier. First of all, the relationship between Frasier and Roz, as wonderful as that is and as comedic as it was, would not have lasted as long because she didn't do the job well. Plus, she didn't treat the host correctly. The animosity between some of the characters, Bulldog breaking into the show and doing all, I mean, fisticuffs would have broken out over a lot of the things that took place. The radio part was admittedly secondary to the focal point of that show and the characters, and as a result, it suffered. It wasn't real radio.
Now, let me ask you something here. If we look at WKRP in Cincinnati as the type of TV show that best reflects the reality of working in radio.
And by the way, let me rephrase it. It best reflects on working in small radio.
In small radio.
Which I have done as well too. And I truly do believe the fact that broadcasting, like I said earlier, I enjoyed working the board because I do believe you have to work your way up. You shouldn't just be handed an on-air position. There was a time when you would never get an on-air job at a station as large as one's in Montreal. You had to go someplace else. I did that. I went to Brockville, Ontario, and worked in a 1,000-watt radio station for 2.5 years in a city which I had nothing against the people who live there and nothing against the type of lifestyle that people had living there. But for me personally, I hated it. I just hated it. 2.5 years of my life that I will never get back, but 2.5 years of my life that I had to do.
And why did you hate it so much? I mean, you were doing radio.
I went there to cut my salary in half and double the black population. That's what I went to Brockville, Ontario to do.
You see, now I can't even comment on that without getting into trouble, so we're going to move on to another topic.
You know, I'm a big city boy, and Brockville is not a big city. And while there are people out there, and by the way, from a touristy travel point of view, the Thousand Islands is one of the most beautiful parts of this country.
Mm-hmm.
It is a great place to spend time in the summer. The population of that area triples in the summer because it's cottage country and a lot of people live there. I'm not a cottage kind of guy. I'm a big city boy. That kind of lifestyle does not interest me in any way, shape, or form. When I worked in Brockville, I spent 2 weekends in 2.5 years in Brockville. And that's because in 2 subsequent Februaries, I had to work as part of the Brockville Ookpik Winter Carnival, which our radio station was part of. When I finished on the air, I did afternoon drive. When I finished on the air on Friday afternoon, when I said my goodbyes, my chair was spinning because you didn't see me for the dust. I was on the 401 so fast coming to Montreal every week. That place was a faded memory to me the second I was on the 401. And I got a lot of speeding tickets going home, rarely got a speeding ticket going back to Brockville.
Okay, I think we've established that Brockville is, as nice a place as it is, just not for you.
Not for me, no.
Okay. Now, getting back to small radio stations and the type of people you're going to find in radio, do you have any comment as to why you think those type of loners and maybe people who are just a little bit off gravitate towards a profession in radio and broadcasting?
Oh, we're getting to the psychology of radio now, are we?
Yes, we are.
I don't think there's anybody in broadcasting who doesn't have, to a certain point of, certain degree, people are going to say that everyone in broadcasting has an ego. Well, first of all, everyone has an ego. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's what manifests itself in broadcasters. I think an ego is sometimes masking an insecurity. And I will say that I think everyone in broadcasting, to a certain degree, has some sort of insecurity. That I will say. If it manifests itself as an ego, that's one thing, and it does in a lot of people. But I think the underlying thing for a lot of people in broadcasting is some sort of insecurity.
But is that really fair to say? I mean, everybody's insecure about something. So is that the one main attribute for people who want to get into broadcast radio?
Well, I mean, there has to be a spark, there has to be a passion for it. But you're at the and it's the same thing with actors. You're talking about a profession where you're saying to somebody, "Look at me," or "Listen to me."
Isn't it possible that the person who's saying, "Look at me, listen to me," is doing so because they actually feel that what they have to say or present is of a greater value? As opposed to...
Is that not ego-driven?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But see, I never looked at it that way when I was on the air. For instance, I in any show I've ever done, you have never heard me say, my guest today is. because until they change the radio station's call letters to CPAH, then they're not even my guests. They're our guests. And even though I do an online program now, which is essentially a one-man band, I still use the royal we. I never said my guest or I'm talking to. It's always we are talking to. And I've never thought that what I had to say was more important or something you needed to hear. It was more like, gosh, have I got a story to share with you?
Let's change the direction of this interview a little bit. I'm very curious about what obstacles you had to personally overcome to have a career as a broadcaster. Something that maybe the average person would never even consider.
Well, at the time I got into radio. By the way, I should mention that I'm a licensed projectionist. Do you know that?
No, I did not.
Yeah, I'm a licensed projectionist. You know, back in the day, to be a projectionist, I don't know if it's the same way now, but you had to do 500 hours of apprenticeship. I used to work in the movie theaters. I did that for 6 years. To be a licensed projectionist, you have to do a 500-hour apprenticeship, and then you have to write a provincial exam. And it's an extremely good-paying job, by the way.
Okay.
Extremely good-paying job. So, I'm technically a licensed projectionist. And the reason why I'm a licensed projectionist is because when I told my family I was going into broadcasting, the exact terminology from everyone in the family is, we have to get that boy a trade.
They were worried that you wouldn't be able to find work as a broadcaster?
Because this isn't going... Well, first of all, let's go back to the 70s and find me a black person in radio or television.
Bill Cosby?
Canadian radio or television? I'm not talking... and by the way, he's a stand-up comedian. So eliminate actors. Broadcasters.
Just broadcasters.
Broadcasters. Canadian broadcasters.
Who are black?
Yep.
To be very honest, I don't know enough to be able to answer that.
Because there wasn't any.
And that was the concern that your family had, that, okay, you're a black man getting into a profession where there are no black men already working.
Exactly.
And they wanted you to take a trade to make sure that, at the very least, you'd be able to get a job and support yourself.
And I paid no attention to them, by the way.
Well, you did become a licensed projectionist, so...
I was already working as a theater usher, so it's not like I wasn't in the building.
Just out of curiosity, what theater did you work at?
All the ones that are closed. What, do you want the list?
Did you ever work at the Palace Theater?
Let's start from the ones that let's start at the Avenue Theater, the Westmount Square, the Seville, the York, the Dollar Drive-In, Snowden Theater.
I used to work as a movie theater usher as well.
Where did you work?
Palace Theater, the Lowe's, the Eaton Center, the Imperial.
Who were your managers? Let me guess. Did you work with Armand Zwibble at any point?
The name is very familiar.
He was an usher with me.
Wow.
So was Pat Chiaffi. He was an usher with me too.
Oh, he was one of the managers that I worked for.
He was an usher when I was an usher. He was at the Avenue Theater with me. And the biggest problem we had is back then ushers used to wear the red suits, and we couldn't find one big enough for Pat because Pat's very tall.
I remember Mr. Chiaffi. Yeah.
Yep. Oh, Mr. Chiaffi. Oh my.
Well, he was the manager at the time that I started, so you got to show respect for your elders.
Yeah.
Okay, so getting back to this. Now, would you say that you faced a racial stigma trying to break into the business? Because it sounds like you went to school, you impressed people with your skill, you were given opportunities. Did your race ever play a factor in you not getting an opportunity?
Probably. I got some great advice from one of my first bosses, and this is, again, I'm already at FM 96.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter Sherman, who was the general manager at the time of both FM 96 and CJAD. And for the purposes of the story, I will point out that Peter is Jewish. Peter said to me, sat me down in the office, and he said, there are going to be people out there who aren't going to be as open-minded, especially in smaller communities, because you're looking to apply to smaller radio stations. So let them know right off the bat exactly who you are. And he told me when I used to send out resumes, I always used to tell people that I would do charity work for B'nai B'rith. that kind of let them know who they were dealing with. With you, send out a picture. Right? You don't want to go someplace you're not wanted. You don't want to be there. And he was right. So I happened to, when I was at Dawson College, I did some charity work and got myself in the newspaper, and that's one of the ways I actually got one of my first jobs at FM 96, because a lot of the notoriety that I garnered from doing a charity event, and it got my picture in the newspaper. So I sent out with my resume when I was looking for that small radio market to break into. I sent out a copy of the story about what I did in college radio, which included my picture.
Now, I can understand your mentor's advice. Send out a picture so that they know. I think it makes a lot of sense. But do you think that maybe you might have cost yourself an opportunity where somebody may not have been comfortable at first, but then once you're there, gets to know you, and were you willing to take that kind of a risk?
Absolutely.
Okay. Have you ever, in the profession of being a broadcaster, faced that kind of prejudice on a professional level?
Can't say that I have. I lost a gig, because I also do voice gigs. Mm-hmm. I lost a gig where they wanted a West Indian accent, and I am of West Indian background and technically have a West Indian accent. I lost a gig to a white guy. Does that...
Okay, well, you didn't lose that job because you were black. You lost.
No.
Okay.
I just get a kick out of teasing the guy who got the gig because supposedly his West Indian accent, they liked it better than mine. It's like, really? Okay. But by the way, going back to what I said earlier about if somebody can talk you out of doing something, then it's not where you're meant to be. A lot of people, and okay, let me bring it down to the racial aspect of it. A lot of people, when I was growing up, I grew up to West Indian parents. Yes, I'm born here, but I grew up to West Indian parents. I don't know where your parents are from, Frank. I don't know if they're Canadians or not.
My parents are actually from Italy. They immigrated here, but I was born here.
Okay, so you were born here. So chances are, between the ages of 1 and I don't know if you were old enough to have gone to preschool, but I did not live in a preschool world. So the first time I went to school was kindergarten.
Yeah, me too.
So from the ages of 1 to 5 years old, or at least 1 to 4.5, chances are you probably sounded Italian.
Yes, I did.
Because you had an intonation.
I sounded very Italian. I get you. I'm right there with you.
The same thing happens with kids of color or of any other ethnic background. And if a person comes to you and say, no, we're not going to give you a job on the radio because we don't like the sound of your voice, some black kids would take that the wrong way and think that they were being subjected to racism, which is not the case. They were being pointed out for their intonation. I had an intonation. I had to get rid of it. Some kids would use that as a stumbling block. Every wall they came across, they decided not to go over or around, they just stopped at. And blame somebody else for their shortcomings. Okay, I have an intonation, I have to get rid of it. That's the way I saw it.
It must have been difficult for you, though, because I think you did the right thing, but you've taken so much extra responsibility, so much extra effort on your part. And I
don't see how it's more responsibility or more effort. I've had the opportunity to go to some schools to talk to kids, and they asked me to talk to, in some cases, a lot of inner city kids, and a lot of inner city kids, that's a euphemism for black, right? So when you talk to black kids, you hear, and you're the child of an immigrant, so you might have heard the same thing growing up. I would ask students in school, and I'm talking to primarily black kids, but you can extrapolate this to immigrant children in general. When you were growing up, did your parents ever tell you that you had to work twice as hard as the Canadian kids, or as my parents used to say, as the white kids? You have to work twice as hard to get ahead. Did you ever hear that from your parents?
Oh, yeah.
So when I asked that question to the kids in school, almost every hand went up. Some people use that as a crutch and put it in front of them. The analogy I gave them is, if you want to go to the Olympics and you want to win gold, you have to be better than anybody else in the world. Now that you know that, are you going to give up? Or are you going to try to be better than anyone else in the world? So your parents say you have to be twice as good as some other kid. What's wrong at being the best you can be? I have never competed with somebody else by trying to be twice as good as them. I've just tried to be the best I could be.
One of the things that I teach as part of my work, especially when I'm dealing with guys who are struggling with life, maybe emotional issues, dealing with their own emotional needs, and that is the only person they're really in competition with is themselves. They're not competing with the other guy to get a girl. They're really competing with themselves to be the best person they could be. Not just a little bit better than the guy they perceive as the competition, but to be their absolute best. Because if you get the girl, it's because you're at your best. And if you didn't get the girl, it isn't because some other guy was better than you, it's because you're not at your best. And what you just said there just reminded me of that.
I'm not a fan of golf, but golf is a major analogy for life, because no golfer is competing with any other golfer but themselves.
Mm-hmm. I fully agree. We got a break for commercial. When we come back, we'll be talking with Peter Anthony Holder, a professional broadcaster. You're listening to Frank Talks, Pleasures and Lifestyles. We'll be back right after this.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by the Emotional Needs of Women Intro 101 CD. This CD is an introduction to the emotional needs of women as taught by Canada's most international relationship expert, Frank Kermit. Women can only fill one of two roles in any man's life. She is either his mother or she is his lover. She cannot be both. What does it take to make a woman feel special so that she would have sex with one man right away when that same woman would make another man wait months? Why do women tend to fall in love with men that they just plan to only have sex with? What are the emotional needs of women and the philosophies that make up Frank B. Kermit's mother-lover theory? If you are curious about this Frank philosophy and wanted an introduction, then consider this CD a primer. Women's Emotional Needs 101 Intro CD. Buy this CD now at franktalks.com.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. What would your life be like if you knew exactly what to say and do with women? Learn how to handle women's tests by addressing her emotional needs. By this, you create the type of attraction that will make her see you as the one. This book is a guide for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by 101 Great First Dates, 101 places to go. In 101 Great First Dates, Where to Go, Frank B. Kermit gives over 101 places to go on a first date. He rates each place on the criteria of cost, forced impressions of social pressure, focus interactive to examine how focused you and your date can be on each other, if the date location has an easy out in case things do not go smoothly, and the sexability of each location. How do all these factors work together to make sex happen on the first date, and to make the most of each location on a first date? The answer to these questions and more in this section of a program that will help you build the best first dates possible. 101 Great First Dates, 101 Places to Go. On sale now at franktalks.com.
You're listening to Frank Talks Pleasures and Lifestyles. I'm Frank because I have to be. I am having an absolutely great time talking with this gentleman, Mr. Peter Anthony Holder. He is a professional broadcaster and an incredibly charismatic and entertaining man. Welcome back, Peter.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start off with what projects you've got on the go right now. Now, you mentioned your own internet podcast show. I want to know how people can reach you and anything that you're doing right now that you want to bring attention to. So this is your time.
I'm working as a television news anchor, because that's what's actually paying the bills right now. I work at Global Television News here in Montreal, and I work as a part-time anchor, which is certainly a lot of fun. And what was very, very nice is the fact that the television station came to me and said, "Would you like to do this?" And I thought, well, sure, why not? So I'm doing that. I also do the online version of the old radio show I did, which is now called The Stuff File, and stuff is spelled S-T-U-P-H, which are my initials, right? So it's The Stuff File, and you can go to the website, thestufffile.com. It's a once-a-week, 1-hour show with quirky interviews and odd news, and it's a lot of fun, if I don't say so myself. And doing a little voice work here and there, and some creative writing and some freelance writing. I'm looking for more work writing in television, which is something I have done a lot of years on. I worked on a television show for several years called Canadian Case Files, which I wrote. And I like to think that my house is the house that Canadian Case Files built. So there's all that other freelance stuff that I do, and I'm available for hire. So there you go.
Do you have a website that people can check out to see your...
Yes, it's PeterAnthonyHolder.com. Very simple and non-narcissistic.
Yeah, right. You, a narcissist? Someone who works in the media? No.
Nah.
You barely have an ego.
There you go.
That's just hiding insecurities.
Yeah.
So PeterAnthonyHolder.com.
That is correct.
So if anybody wants to find Peter Anthony Holder, then you're going to have to figure out how to get to PeterAnthonyHolder.com. All right, I want to talk about some of the better experiences you've had in your career. Who are some of the people you really enjoyed working with? What were some of the jobs you've had that just you remember them with a dear fondness?
Well, the radio show I did for 20 years at CJAD had an opportunity to talk to a lot of fine people, work with a lot of great people, work with a lot of childhood idols. I grew up listening to George Balkan. I first met George Balkan when I was 15 years old, and to have an opportunity to work with George, to work with Gord Sinclair, to befriend these people, to work with Ted Blackman. These are memories no one will ever be able to take away, considering the fact that I grew up in radio. I grew up wanting to be in radio because I listened to these guys when I was 9 years old. To end up working with them, it's the equivalent of someone saying, I want to be on the Montreal Canadiens, and because you grew up watching Jean Beliveau, and Jean Beliveau was around for 20 years, and in the final years of his career, you're his line mate. That's the example I can give. I mean, that's the career I've had. I've worked with the people I completely idolized. For a couple of years, I worked at Listen Audio, a place which was a production house here in town. And I worked on 2 radio shows, one called The Royal Reporter, which was called that because it was sponsored by the Royal Bank, and the other one called the Air Canada program because, guess what? It was sponsored by the Air Canada, the airline. And George Morris owns that studio, Listen Audio. I worked for him for a couple of years, and I got to travel because I worked. The Air Canada show was a travel program. Well, George Morris was Buddy G on CKGM, and it was his voice that I first heard and said, "That's what I want to do." When I was 9 years old, and by the way, he had been in radio since he was 15. So when I was 9 years old, I said, "I want to be him," and I ended up years later working for him. So that was a fun job to do.
Sounds like you've had a really good time.
I've had a fantastic time.
Normally we don't go negative on this show, but I'm really curious because you seem to have such a positive attitude. Any regrets about your career? And I normally don't ask this question. It's just that you've got such a very positive attitude towards everything you've done, everything you've had to battle through, and I gotta ask you, do you have any regrets whatsoever regarding your career?
I don't have any regrets in life. Never mind my career. Because to have regrets would mean that there's something I would want to change. And if I were to change anything along the way, it would change who I am right now. And I happen to like who I am and where I am, and I wouldn't want to change anything. So I have no regrets. I've never had any regrets.
If you could go back in time and visit yourself at a younger stage, what advice would you give your younger self?
That kind of ties in with the last answer I had, and that is I would tell the younger Peter nothing. Because that's like, and as I said, I worked in the movie theaters for years, that's like standing in the line outside of the movie theater waiting to get in, and somebody comes out of the theater and tells you one of the best parts of the film. No. You gotta go in there and enjoy the movie for its entire length.
There's nothing you would want to tell yourself and say, hey, keep an eye out for this thing, or prepare?
No, because if I were to do that again, it would change who I am today. No. I have to take the good with the bad, and I have to experience all the things that I experienced to get where I am today. No, I wouldn't warn myself about anything. Or anyone. Not at all. All the bad situations, I mean, you know, I was at CJD for 20 years and got canned last year. They can only fire you. They can't kill you. Right? Mm-hmm. I would never have worked at Listen Audio if I wasn't fired from CFCF. The list goes on and on and on. The good comes out of the bad and vice versa. It's all part of life. I wouldn't go back and change a thing.
Peter, this has been a fantastic interview. I had a great time talking with you. You've definitely even pumped me up, which is really nice, and you gave me a good laugh. So, just for the people listening, if they want to get a hold of you, where can they go?
They can go to my website, which is peteranthonyholder.com. The stufffile.com is also a website, but it leads to the same place. So if you can remember how to spell my name, then it might be easier. That's peteranthonyholder.com. They can listen to the Stuff File, which comes out every Monday. It's heard on cyberstationusa.com. It's also heard on KDXradio.com out of Illinois. It's on PJC Radio out of Taiwan. It's on 2 radio stations. It's on Gold FM in Singapore, and it's on World FM in New Zealand. And of course, they can find it on my website, on my blog, which is at Blogspot, and they can also subscribe to it as a podcast via iTunes. There you go. And tune in to Global Television here in Montreal, because I occasionally work there as a news anchor, Global News, 6 and 11, which is channel 8 on your cable grid, channel on your illico box, channel 3 on your cable grid, and channel 234 on Bell Express. I think I got all the plugs in there.
Perfect. Exactly what I was hoping for. Peter, it's been absolutely great. I definitely hope that I'll be able to interview you again sometime in the future when you've got a new project out and you want to help get the word out. You can definitely count on Frank Talks.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank.
He's Peter Anthony Holder. His website is peteranthonyholder.com, professional broadcaster. You're listening to Frank Talks, Pleasures and Lifestyles. Good night, everybody.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by 101 Great First Dates, 101 places to go. In 101 Great First Dates, Where to Go, Frank B. Kermit gives over 101 places to go on a first date. He rates each place on the criteria of cost, forced impressions of social pressure, Focus Interactive to examine how focused you and your date can be on each other, if the date location has an easy out in case things do not go smoothly, and the sexability of each location. How do all these factors work together to make sex happen on the first date, and to make the most of each location on a first date? The answer to these questions and more in this section of a program that will help you build the best first dates possible. 101 Great First Dates, 101 Places to Go. On sale now at franktalks.com.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test, a man's guide to the emotional needs of women. What would your life be like if you knew exactly what to say and do with women? This book is for the guy that simply wants to learn how to handle women's tests by addressing her emotional needs. By this, you create the type of attraction that will make her see you as the one she was destined to be with. This book will teach you how to get the woman you want and how to keep her. Everything Out of Her Mouth is a Test is the Rosetta Stone for men to understand exactly what a woman means when she speaks and how to respond. Is that worth changing your life forever? Buy this book at franktalks.com now.
Frank Talks is sponsored in part by 101 Great First Dates, How to Act. This program is about first dates. In the rules for how to act, Frank B. Kermit goes over various guidelines to keep in mind to turn your first dates into the first of many dates with the focus of your affection. How should a person act on a first date? Is sex on a first date a good idea? And if so, how does a person create the opportunity for it? What are some of the things to never do on a first date, and why? The answers to these questions and more in 101 Great First Dates, the First Dates program that will help you build the best first dates possible. On sale now at franktalks.com.